The Roswell Nurse by Richard L. Elsliger. Ingrid Wolf never asked to be put in this situation. She fell into it by happenstance, a fortuitous calamity of circumstances that converged to bring her to this point in her life, and what she saw with her own eyes repulsed her in a primeval way. When she looked at the shroud pulled over the small body, she thought that a child had died. When the doctor pulled back the sheet, she lurched back in terror. The subject measured 3.5 feet by her reckoning, and this was no child's corpse. The army staff had prepared Ingrid for a horrific encounter, but not of this magnitude. Her mind swam with nightmarish imaginings of off-world beings, the stuff of inconceivable science fiction. "Stay strong," said Dr. Stevens. "Stay strong and we'll get through this together." Ingrid nodded and steadied herself, drawing closer to the tray of instruments positioned next to the autopsy table. 2 motion picture cameras positioned on either side of the table ran in locked-off shots, a steady stream of film running at 24 frames per second. Dr. Stevens asked for a hacksaw, and she handed over the requested tool, its metal blade notched with a sea monster's worth of serrated teeth designed for cutting through the toughest metal. The doctor handled the saw like a metallurgist and cut away the cadaver's suit, a metallic-colored shirt with insignia on the chest. With no buttons and no apparent way to pull the shirt over such an enormous head, the hacksaw proved its worth. The metallized shirt resisted his initial efforts, but undeterred he maintained a steady motion, and the teeth began to chew through the toughened uniform. The material gave an impression of some exotic alloy, a shirt that vacuum formed over the body. With each swipe of the fine-toothed saw, it created light amber sparks. The metallic shirt yielded, and the doctor sectioned the cut pieces into 2 halves, exposing a dull gray flesh beneath. The metallized shirt contracted like shrink wrap in reaction to being unfolded. The material must have utilized some memory program that made it adapt to its conditions. Dr. Stevens gave fearful glances to the photographer, who snapped photographs in rapid fire. Stevens requested a scalpel from Nurse Wolf. She removed a sharp instrument from the tray, and it sparkled in her gloved hand with lethal intent under the overhead surgical lamps. Ingrid steadied herself and delivered the knife to Stevens with a nervous hand. Dr. Stevens cut into the corpse, and immediately a thick black sludge oozed from its chest cavity. The alien smell overpowered their surgical masks, forcing the medical team to evacuate the room for fresher air. They gagged and coughed beyond the door of the operating room, appalled at the hideous odor that welled up from the entity. The smell was not of this world, but from a world far beyond. Just how far, no one knew. The 2 sentries on either side of the door stood at attention. Nurse Wolf retreated into her own mind and reviewed her young life, piecing together how she got to this particular place and this particular moment of time. Ingrid Wolf was a civilian and a native to New Mexico. She grew up in the vicinity of Albuquerque and chose nursing to be her contribution to the world. She missed the war by 1 year, graduating from nursing school in 1946. She found her full-time job at a local hospital, and it was not long before the military called her away from her duties to tend to this monstrous project. Military medical staff were in short supply at war's end, many of the nurses still serving in Europe and other parts of the world. Ingrid answered the call when a high-ranking Army officer got her on the phone late Friday night and summoned her skills for a matter of most urgent importance. Her hospital employer gave the nod, and she was whisked away by night to the military base in an Army jeep. Now she stood outside the operating room, retching on the vile contents of an alien being, a unique privilege no one on planet Earth had ever experienced to this point in history, at least as far as she knew. The stern military police stood firm outside the room, substantial sidearms of high caliber held in their unbridled holsters, ready to be drawn at the first sign of trouble, alien or otherwise. She wanted to ask the most fundamental question about what it was and where it came from. Another look at the military police, whose eyes converged upon her, made her dismiss any idea of asking questions at this juncture and to follow the program. "Is everyone okay?" asked Dr. Stevens. Ingrid nodded along with the photographer. She looked for a name tag on his medical garb, but saw none, unlike Dr. Stevens, whose name was prominently displayed on his white gown. Ingrid decided not to ask. "Okay, let's go back in," said Stevens. The 3 entered the room and resumed their wretched work. Dr. Stevens continued with the scalpel and utilized the customary Y incision on the body, opening the alien contents to the air. The vile smell multiplied by a factor of 10, but Stevens pushed through, folding back the skin and removing cartilage. Inside the cavity, a series of internal organs of unspecified purpose exposed their alien shapes to a world alien in its own right. The photographer snapped pictures in a frenzied manner, obtaining a multitude of camera angles all around the alien cadaver, while the motion picture cameras continued to roll. Dr. Stevens pointed Ingrid toward a series of numbered tags and instructed that she was to attach each tag to the organ removed and to memorialize the rancid organs in numerical order of removal. Dr. Stevens commenced and pulled on the first organ that came out with some resistance. A mild corona discharge flared from inside the body cavity when he pulled out the organ with his gloved hands. The organ looked similar to a human heart, but on a smaller scale. Stevens' forehead wrinkled like a prune when, much to his horror, the flesh of the organ contained the finest threads of electrodes and wiring that pulled away from the body in a clump. Stevens handed the flesh and its dangling wires to Ingrid. She hesitated to hold it, but remembered why she was there and instinctively cupped her hands together. The photographer continued to bombard the procedure with incessant photo shots. When he used up the film on one camera, he took another off of the shelf where several dozen lay ready to preserve a visual documentation of the outlandish procedure. Ingrid struggled to maintain her composure, but got control of her mind and labeled the organ. She dropped it in a cold metal tray. The organ twitched several times when she placed it in the tray, then went still. "Did you see that?" said Ingrid. Dr. Stevens, the photographer, and Ingrid looked at each other with tacit acknowledgement that they all saw it thump. No one said a thing in answer to Ingrid's inquiry. Stevens swiped his forehead with the sleeve of his gown. "Let's keep going," he said. Dr. Stevens pushed forth and removed the remaining organs with methodical precision, handing them individually to Ingrid. She dutifully labeled each and placed them in separate trays, bearing the sequential number that designated the order of removal. Stevens paused to gather his thoughts between each removal. He marveled at the biological architecture of this sentient being, a thing never seen before. Ingrid jotted copious notes on a pad, while the photographer continued to snap pictures of the alien cadaver from every conceivable angle. Dr. Stevens took a pause and checked the emptied cavity of the alien being. Ingrid took the hiatus to study the corpse in greater visual detail, awestruck by its very existence. She touched the metal shirt, curious about its texture. The exotic metal fabric yielded to her touch and shrank around her fingers. She pulled back, and the fabric resumed its flattened status, resumed its shrink-wrapped properties. Ingrid studied the head, an enlarged bulb suggestive of a big brain, disproportionate to the rest of the body. She noted the head and face were devoid of hair. Leathery gray skin enveloped the skull and cloaked the hairless torso. Leopard skin splotches of black mottled the gray skin at the pelvic region down to its metallic pants. The left eye remained half closed, pinched by the upper and lower lids, no doubt a reaction in death, she considered, the oily black ball beneath the lids occupying a large part of the face. The right eye stared up to the ceiling, fully open. Ingrid examined the exposed eye, searching for any possible movement, fearful the thing might look at her with an insidious plan to project its alien soul into her body through the open eye and take over her conscience. She considered it a silly notion, but not one she could readily dismiss. The eye reflected a grim coldness, the cold blackness of space, and she wondered what great things this being must have seen, the intergalactic secrets locked behind the eyes, other worlds, planets never experienced by her own species, such secrets that died with this being, never more to be shared. Her initial fear turned to intense sorrow for this creature, having died upon an alien world away from its own kind, a lonely death so far from its ancestral home. Were there any more from the crash, and did any survive? She dared not ask. "Nurse Wolfe, please pass me the bone saw," said Stevens. Ingrid snapped out of her off-world excursion, lifted the saw from the tray and handed it to Dr. Stevens. He dug into a toughened part of the skeleton, a long and snake-like spine. He sawed away pieces of bone, and the smell intensified. Stevens stopped in the middle of his work. "I have to leave for a minute. I just can't take the smell," he said. "Agreed," said the photographer, putting down his camera. He shut down the motion picture cameras, and they whirred to a halt. Nurse Wolf, after you." Dr. Stevens extended a hand to her, and she took her leave, followed by the men. They exited to the hallway and removed their masks, coughing and gagging on the hideous odor of alien rot. The military police remained stalwart and stone-faced. Through the glass of the operating room door, Ingrid could see the dissected alien, and she watched the body with morbid fascination. Again, she began to imagine what it might be like to die on a foreign world. This time she wanted to know, "Is this from the flying disc they spoke about in the San Mateo newspaper?" she asked. "Yes," said Dr. Stevens. "They recovered 2 more bodies they put on ice, and we were given this one to experiment on. One of them survived, so I'm told." The photographer looked at the military police for any reaction at this disclosure of information. They stood at attention, guarding both sides of the door, giving no hint of their thought processes, other than displaying their military duties to guard the secret inside that operating room of the military base. "I can't believe what I am seeing," said Ingrid. "I mean, it's too much for my mind to process." "We feel the same way," said Stevens. "The world as I know it has changed for me. It's changed for all of us." One of the guards broke his protocol and looked at Dr. Stevens with a troubled look. "Nothing leaves this base, either that alien or any mention of the crash," he said. Dr. Stevens turned to the MP and folded down the collar of his medical gown. "You see that, son?" The guard looked at the bird insignias. "That's right. That means full bird colonel as well as a surgeon, which means I outrank you. I caution you to mind your mouth. Do we understand each other?" "Yes, sir," he said, and stood at attention, eyes forward. "If anything gets leaked, that's my responsibility, not yours." The exchange made Ingrid queasy. "Can I go outside for a minute?" she asked. "You're free to do so, Nurse Wolf. Don't be too long. I want to wrap this up." Ingrid nodded and walked the corridor. She pushed past several more guards positioned at various points along the way to the exit. Outside, she filled her lungs with cool night air. She cast her pale eyes skyward and saw unquantifiable numbers of cold, flickering lights, each representing a faraway world, one of them perhaps signifying the home world of this poor, wretched alien. She wondered if he had a family, and if that family missed him, or had any idea that he would never return. She wiped away tears. She needed to compose herself and took several deep breaths before going back inside. She put on her surgical mask and re-entered the installation. She strode the corridor and pushed open the operating room door. "Ready?" asked Stevens. "Ready," said Ingrid. Dr. Stevens touched the skull. The soft shell flexed like a leather football under applied pressure from his fingers. Stevens himself removed a scalpel from the tray and cut into the head. The skull peeled apart like a banana, exposing an orange brain crisscrossed with circuits, diodes, and wires. He stepped away and braced himself against the table. "Are you going to be okay?" asked the photographer. "I'm fine," said Stevens. "Let's continue." He took hold of the brain and pulled on it. The brain fluoresced with a brilliant, bright flash and died away in a few short seconds. Wire endings and ganglia continued to spark with their own pinpricks of white light, and then it went dead. Stevens held the mass in his hands and shifted it from side to side, failing to understand the meaning of the wiring, unable to ascertain if it was living or some sort of machine. He handed the brain to Ingrid, and she catalogued it once she dropped it into the bowl. "I think we're done here," said Stevens. He stepped out and made a call from the base phone, and in minutes a second team arrived. 3 men dressed in white coats came in through the operating room door, along with medical equipment that neither Stevens, Ingrid, nor the photographer had ever seen before. Ingrid left the room with Stevens, and the photographer stayed behind. Dr. Stevens and Ingrid headed down the hall and signed out from the facility, she and Dr. Stevens showing their identification. Again, Ingrid wanted to ask questions but restrained such inquisitions as imprudent. "Are you going to be all right?" asked Stevens. "Yes," said Ingrid. "It's been a tough evening, but I'll be okay." "Well, good night, Nurse Wolf. I'll order a jeep to take you home." "Thank you, Dr. Stevens." The jeep arrived at the steps of the hangar and took Ingrid home. The driver said very little, and Ingrid avoided answers of any substance. Neither spoke of what her work entailed. When she arrived home, she bathed away the filth of her experience, then collapsed into a heap in her bed. She dreaded the nightmares that would follow, and they did, in the most unspeakable of ways. She slept through most of the day. She awoke refreshed and went into town for dinner. Ingrid decided on her favorite diner, a well-attended, quaint restaurant frequented by most of the townspeople. Ingrid pushed on the door and the overhead bell rang with a friendly jingle. She picked her customary location, a window booth. Her neighbor spotted her immediately and changed seats from the counter to sit with her. "Ingrid, so good to see you." "Hello, Bill. Good to see you, too." Bill Buckley claimed a seat across from Ingrid, a cordial man in his early 20s, a wiry man of considerable physical strength who worked with his hands tending to cattle and mending broken fences in the literal sense. Ingrid admired his square jaw and muscular features. She reveled in his steel-gray eyes that penetrated beyond her own, as if reading her thoughts. "So how is nursing going for you?" "Going well," she said. Ingrid checked the diner for any unfamiliar faces, and she clutched her hands together in deep contemplation of her next words. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Ingrid churned inside, keeping her nervous energy in self-containment. She deliberated on how she would answer his question. "Bill, can you keep a secret?" "Well, you know I can," he said. "Seems there are a lot of secrets going on in Roswell ever since that flying saucer crash." Ingrid shot nervous glances around the diner, searching for anyone out of place, a possible military observer sent to watch her every move. "That is exactly what I want to talk about. Can I trust you to secrecy?" "Yes, ma'am." Ingrid proceeded to tell her story, the late-night call from the military base, the autopsy room, and the alien they picked apart. When she was done, Bill fixed his eyes upon hers for any hint of deception. "Well, that's quite a story," he said, "but no less unusual than the buzz around town. Hell, the buzz around the whole country about Roswell, right?" "Right," she said. The two ate dinner in mutual silence. Bill asked for the check and they were done. "I hope to see you again," he said. Ingrid blushed and agreed. She departed down the street and headed for the hospital to work a night shift, praying that exposure to human patients once more might dull the images of the alien so prevalent in her every thought. She accomplished her shift relatively free of mental interference with the awful deed done Friday night. When she left work and headed home, the empty silence of her apartment weighed on her emotions and she broke down. Still, she sensed the filth of that vile autopsy sticking to her flesh and the unearthly smell of alien death she could not extricate from her memory. She turned on the radio and drew some bath water in her pedestal tub. She switched away from the local and national news, trumpeting their brand of gloom, and found a music station to help unwind the last day, absorbed in a highly sensitive and highly secretive government project. Ingrid laid back in her tub and placed a warm washcloth over her eyes. She soaked in the warm water and let the soap bubbles caress her skin. On came Moonlight Serenade, a dreamy swing ballad that flowed from the speaker grill of the radio, delicately massaging her ears with a delightful, faraway tune. The music carried her to those formative years, and she wondered if the alien world had such a thing as music, and if it did, what that music might be. The knob to her front door twisted in silence with the confidence of a clock hand sweeping the dial of a watch. The door opened an inch at a time, and soon revealed a figure dressed in black. He made his way with confident footfalls, treading the carpet with the stealthy silence of a predatory animal. The music attracted his attention to the bathroom. He peered in at Ingrid and removed a silk scarf from his trench coat pocket. He wound each end of the scarf around his hands and tugged on the scarf, making it tense in his powerful grip. Ingrid reveled in the bath water, motionless and relaxed. The figure advanced with outstretched arms, the silken scarf pulled taut end to end. He stopped. He began to unwrap the scarf and tucked it back in his coat pocket. The dark figure tilted his head, looking at the radio sitting on the stool next to the tub. Without so much as a hesitation, he placed a gloved hand on the radio and conducted an effortless push, shoving the radio into the tub with Ingrid. The current streamed through her body, affecting every nerve ending, and her brain went on fire. She saw images of her life melt together and felt coldness in her abdomen like a refrigerated egg breaking apart inside her stomach. A shower of sparks lit up the bathroom, and Ingrid's body tensed and shivered, every muscle contracting and pulverizing her joints and snapping bones. The radio shorted out and the music stopped. Her body went limp and her torso slid into the watery depths. Her face slipped under, eyes open. Small bubbles rose up from her submerged open mouth, and they popped on the surface. He looked down at her for a good minute to ensure that if the electrical current failed to do its work, the drowning water inevitably would. When he saw no further movement in that minute, he left, satisfied. On the street, he handed a wad of cash to William Buckley. "I hope she didn't suffer," said Buckley. "It was clean," said the photographer. "Thank you, Mr. Buckley, for doing your civic duty. We can't have lies spread about aliens. It could cause a national panic." "And thank you," said Buckley, stuffing the thick roll of bills in his jacket. "I assume you won't be having any conversations about aliens now, will you, Mr. Buckley?" "You can be sure I won't," he said, and the two parted. On Monday morning, when Ingrid failed to report to work, they found her in the bathtub, most certainly dead. Dr. Stevens intervened during the investigation and had her body taken to the military base. He filled out the death certificate, writing accidental electrocution as the stated cause. He looked at the gutted alien body decked out next to Ingrid in the operating room, and he crouched next to her face. "You couldn't keep your mouth shut, could you, Nurse Wolfe? It was too much to ask, was it? This is your reward, sweetheart. Enjoy your trip to the heavens with your friend here." Dr. Stevens pulled the shroud over Ingrid's face, and he wheeled her body through the courtyard toward the crematorium under the light of a glimmering morning star.